There were originally three parts to my paper. The first part was describe a certain kind of puzzle or paradox, and then explain how contextualism can resolve the paradox. And then I talked about an objection to contextualism raised by John Hawthorne, Jason Stanley, Wayne Davis, and try to reply to that. And then I talk about an alternative to contextualism, an alternative approach to the original problem that Hawthorne has proposed, and I think Stanley following him has also proposed, called subject-sensitive invariantism. But then I found out I only have 30 minutes, so I can't do all of that. And my commentators, the comments that I've seen, don't really talk about the Hawthorne subject-sensitive invariantism at all. They raise sort of fundamental objections to contextualism. So I think then I'll spend a little bit more time than I intended to just explaining contextualism and the objection to it, and not even get into the Hawthorne subject-sensitive invariantism. I'd be willing to in discussion if people want to. By the way, as I went to bed about midnight last night, and as I lay in bed, I was very pleased to hear this raucous goings-on down in the around the bar that I could hear, and I thought, oh, this is good. I should have an advantage on all these people tomorrow. So, okay. So the puzzle I want to discuss has received increasing attention in the literature. As far as I know, it was first raised by Gilbert Harman in Thought. And Hawthorne has called this the lottery puzzle or problem, but you shouldn't confuse that with Keiberg's lottery paradox. It's a different problem. So what's the problem? It's easy enough to illustrate. So let's say there are various things I know about myself. I'm a philosopher with a relatively modest income. It's been getting better in the past few years, but I have some investments that aren't worth very much. They used to be worth a lot more. I have no rich relatives, so on and so on. So one thing it seems that I know about myself is that I'll never be a billionaire. I'll never be rich. Now here's something else that we'll suppose is true about me. It actually isn't. But suppose I bought a ticket in a lottery yesterday, and the prize is $1 billion. One thing, here's a fairly robust intuition. Most people would say that I don't know I'm going to lose the lottery. But now there seems to be a puzzle, because on the one hand, I know I'll never get rich, but that seems to entail that I know I'll lose the lottery, because if I win the lottery, I would be rich. But it seems that I don't know the lottery. I don't know I'm going to lose the lottery. I'm told that the motto of the New York State Lottery is, you never know. Okay. So now we have this puzzle, and if it were just a puzzle about lotteries, you might think, well, this is an interesting little anomaly, but perhaps not of much philosophical significance. But in fact, the puzzle generalizes in interesting ways. I know I'm going to be in Amsterdam in June. I bought my ticket. I've been invited to come. I've got permission from my wife. So that seems fair to say. I know I'm going to be there. On the other hand, I'm at the stage in life where sometimes men in particular drop dead from heart attacks. Now, I hope that won't happen, and I don't think it will, but do I know I won't suffer a fatal heart attack between now and when I leave? Well, it seems wrong to say that that's something that I know. Again, the same puzzle, because my knowing that I'll be in Amsterdam seems to entail my knowing that I won't drop dead from a heart attack. And you can give examples that don't involve the future. I know I left my car parked in my garage. So if you say, do I know where my car is? Sure, it's in my garage. That's something that I know. But do I know it hasn't been stolen? Well, probably not, but it seems wrong to say that I know it hasn't been stolen. But again, knowing it's in the garage seems to entail knowing it will be stolen, knowing it hasn't been stolen. And you can even get inductive example. Gretzky's cleverly disguised mule zebra case has the same structure. Okay, so what's going on? I'm having trouble relating to this microphone. Is this good? Can you hear me now? Okay. So what's going on in all of these cases? The structure is the same. First, there's a plausible principle, which I'll call the deductive closure principle, and I've now adopted, I think, Timothy Williamson's version of it because I think it's the most perspicuous. David, I'm sorry, I think that version I sent you, I had it the other way, but I thought I sent you the updated version. So the principle goes like this. If S knows P and S competently deduces Q from P, then S knows Q. So that looks pretty hard to deny. So that's operating in this paradox, obviously. So let's say the general form is Q on the handout. So there's some proposition, I'll never get rich, my car is parked in my garage, I'll be in Amsterdam. It seems that we know these sorts of propositions, but then there are these lottery propositions. My car hasn't been stolen, I won't drop dead of a heart attack, I won't win the lottery. It seems we don't know the lottery proposition, but then given the deductive closure principle, it seems we know the ordinary propositions only if we know the lottery. So there's a paradox in the sort of classic form, three propositions, each of which seems intuitively quite possible, but they're jointly inconsistent. Okay. So, and of course the paradox is a kind of skeptical paradox because it puts pressure on our claim to know the ordinary propositions. We begin to think, well, maybe we don't really know all of these things. So the idea then is to try to get a view that can solve the paradox in an anti-skeptical way. I mean, you could just say, okay, so let's be skeptics, but that's no fun. You want to try to get some sort of solution to it. It can be fun, Richard says. Now, a constraint on a satisfactory resolution of the paradox, I think, is that you explain why the paradox arises in the way it does. I mean, it's no good to just pick one of the propositions and say, well, that's the false one, and without giving some explanation of why we were tempted to believe it to begin with. Okay, so contextualism, and I hope I don't bore too many of you with the details again, I'll try to do it quickly, is the view that I favor as a response to this kind of paradox. And my particular version of it begins with fallibilism, which is on the handout, number 3. So fallibilism is, I can know that P, even though the probability of P on my evidence is less than 1, that is to say, there's a chance on my evidence that P is false. So why are we fallibilists? Well, not because it just seems obviously true. Maybe it does, but I'm sympathetic to Lewis's sort of worries about this. But we say it because there seems to be no alternative to it if we want to avoid skepticism. So we get ourselves in a fallibilistic frame of mind. You can know, even though your evidence doesn't guarantee the truth of what you believe. But then you might say, well, okay, our evidence only has to make our beliefs probable. But then the question arises, well, how probable, here we're talking about epistemic probability, how probable does our beliefs have to be on our evidence in order for them to be instances of knowledge? Now, contextualism says in response to that question, there's no context invariant answer to it, that how probable your beliefs have to be on your evidence in order for you to know varies from context to context. The context selects a standard that determines how strong your evidence has to be. And again, there's no context-independent standard. So, according to contextualism, ascriptions of knowledge are context-sensitive in just this way. So look at number 4 on the handout, contextualism. The truth value of a sentence of the form S knows P depends on the context of utterance or ascription, however you want to put that. So given a subject S and a proposition P and a time T, it's possible that at T, one ascriber says of that subject and proposition, S knows that P, another says that S does not know that P, and they both speak the truth. That's a consequence of contextualism. How, from the viewpoint of formal semantics, should we think of this context sensitivity? We could think of it, I like to think of it just straightforwardly as a kind of indexicality. So you could think that the knowledge predicate expresses different relations in different contexts. Some people who are more metaphysically minded than I am don't like that, the idea of there being all these different knowledge relations. They don't take up much space. It doesn't bother me, but some people don't like that. So there's an alternative. You can think of knowledge as a three-place relation between a person, a proposition, and a standard. And you can say the knowledge predicate expresses that same relation in every context, but there's an indexical reference to the standard. So the standard place will vary, the value of the standard place will vary with context. Okay, now there's a difficult question about how precisely the standards get fixed in a particular context of ascription. And this is a very difficult question, I think, for context sensitivity in general, not just for knowledge. But it's some complicated function of speaker intentions, listener expectations, presuppositions of the context, what's salient in the context, something that David Lewis called the conversational score. And I'm very sympathetic to that way of doing it. On my view, salience relations are important. In particular, aspects of the context can make certain error possibilities salient. And when these error possibilities are salient, this puts great pressure on the standards to rise. And we are hesitant to ascribe knowledge in these cases. So here's the idea. We're fallibilists. To avoid skepticism, we allow that we can know even though there are alternatives to what we believe consistent with our evidence, error possibilities. But when you make those error possibilities salient, then the standards rise so as to falsify those ascriptions. Now, how can we apply this thesis of context sensitivity of knowledge ascriptions to solve the lottery puzzle? Let me do it in the third person to avoid subject-ascriber conflations, because that's easy to do. So let's talk about John, who's going to England in July. He knows he's going to England in July. Seems right to say that. Fill in the case however you like. But it doesn't seem right to say that he knows the plane won't crash. You know, it's got sometimes you buy flight insurance, right? That would make no sense if you knew the plane wasn't going to crash. So he knows he's going to England, but then we want to say, but he doesn't know the plane won't crash, and that seems to violate the deductive closure principle. So what's going on here? Well, according to context sensitivity, contextualism, in everyday contexts where we're not thinking about things like plane crashes, any kind of error possibility, it's right to say that John knows that he'll be in July. And at that same context, the sentence, he knows he'll be, the plane won't crash, is true. But of course, if you try to utter that sentence, you make the error possibility salient, the possibility that the plane will crash, the standards go up. At this new context, he doesn't know the plane won't crash, and he doesn't know he'll be in England in July. So in what I call everyday, ordinary contexts, it's true that he knows he'll be in England. That sentence is true. Also, the sentence is true that he knows the plane won't crash. In higher standard, stricter standard, skeptical context, if you like, He doesn't know either of those propositions, but the closure principle holds the sentence, that's the way to put it, the sentence expressing the closure principle is true in every context. Okay. So the puzzle arises because we unknowingly shift standards. So there's a kind of what Hawthorne calls a semantic blindness thesis in contextualism, that competent speakers of the language can use an indexical term, in this case knowledge, correctly, in that their knowledge descriptions will track shifts in context, but the speakers are unaware of that this is going on. And this is a controversial and crucial part of contextualism, and I'll say more about it in a minute. Time flies when you're giving a talk. The sense of subjective time flow, depending on which side of the table you're on, is incredible. So obviously we can apply the same diagnosis to all the other instances of the puzzle, which commits me to saying that at ordinary context we know we're going to lose the lottery, and I'm happy to embrace that consequence. I've learned to be happy with it anyway. Or as Richard would say, I've earned a living defending that consequence. Okay, now the objection to contextualism. So Hawthorne, Stanley, Wayne Davis, as far as I know, all independently, I mean it's a sort of natural objection to contextualism, have raised an objection to contextualism based on how they think the knowledge predicate behaves in propositional attitude reports. And it has to do with a kind of disquotational principle that they think is compelling for knowledge. And so, now, where am I? Okay. The argument is to be rigorous and precise, it's very complicated because there are complications involving indexicals. So I'm not going to go through the argument rigorously. It'd be very hard to follow, and I get mixed up. So I wrote it down on the handout here, and if you want to see how it goes, there it is. I'll discuss it more informally, and there's really a kind of very simple idea behind it. So look on the handout at my bold. I was inconsistent in my use of bold here, but there's something called the disquotational schema for knows, which they call DSK, under assumptions. And that says, if an English speaker E sincerely utters a sentence S of the form, I know that P, quote, I know that P, and the sentence in the that clause means that P, then E believes that he knows that P and expresses that belief by uttering S. Okay, that's a mouthful. This is just all that it says. So suppose Rich says, sincerely utters the sentence, I know I have feet. I heard him say that the other day, actually. So then, according to the disquotational principle, if he sincerely utters it, then he believes that he, Rich, knows he has feet and expresses that belief by saying, quote, I know I have feet. Okay, that seems straightforward enough. So if I hear Rich say, sincerely utter, I know I have feet, then I should be able to say, Rich believes that he knows he has feet. Okay, here's the problem for contextualism. Suppose Rich is in a low standards context and I'm in a high standards context. That means that his utterance of the word know will, to put it in one form, express a different relation than my utterance of the word know. So Rich says, quote, I know I have feet, and I disquote and say Rich believes that he knows he has feet. I thereby end up attributing to him a belief he doesn't hold. Because when Rich said, I know I have feet, he meant, I know by low standards I have feet. That was the content of his utterance. When I say Rich believes that he knows he has feet, since I'm in a high standards context, what I say is Rich believes that he knows by high standards that he has feet. But he believes no such thing. So this falsifies the disquotation principle, okay, DSK. Now, what should the contextualist say about this argument? Well, as Peter Ludlow notes in a very interesting paper, whose name of which I can't remember. Does anybody know the name of this Ludlow paper? You've seen it? Thanks. Contextualism in the New Linguistic Turn in Epistemology. I don't think it's out anywhere, but it's an excellent paper, I think. And let's see. Oh, yeah, and it's pro-contextualist. Okay. So Ludlow says that Hawthorne assumes, and Stanley and all these guys, that when I disquote Rich's utterance, the semantic value of nose and my mouth is fixed by the context I began with, my high standards context I began with, rather than Rich's low standard context. But Ludlow says that this isn't true, that if I know that Rich is in a lower standard context from my own, then when I say Rich believes that he knows he has feet, in fact, my utterance of that sentence picks up on the low standards of Rich's context. Hawthorne obviously thinks that it's fixed by the context I begin with. So who's right about this? Well, let me try to give you an example for an uncontroversial case of context sensitivity that I think supports the way Ludlow wants to look at it. So this is an example involving American basketball. So I'll try to give the rest of you the information you need to understand the example. So suppose David, who I know is a basketball fan, and I are talking about basketball, and you know basketball players are very tall, and we're talking about who's tall and who isn't, and we're talking about basketball players, and we say Danny Ainge, or I'm dating myself, Danny Ainge, Kevin Johnson they're not tall. These guys are 6'2", 6'4", 6 feet. Oh no, I'm not going to do meters. Well, anyway, they're 2 meters. What is that? A little over 2 meters. Then we say, but Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Shaquille O'Neal, they're tall. And these guys are what, over 3.5 meters. No, isn't it meters? Oh, that'd be nice. 2.5. 2.5. I meant to say 2.5. 2.5. 217. Whatever. They're tall. Obrigado. I understand that's in Portuguese. All right. So we can truly say Kevin Johnson is not tall. Shaquille O'Neal, he's tall. And suppose we're in public, and we see Michael Jordan walks by. He's about 6'4". I won't try to translate it into meters. 2 meters. He walks by. He's about 6'4". And we see, and there's a little girl with her mother, and she looks up at him and says, "Wow, he's tall." Okay? She's in a low standard context. I think now, but David and I both know they're just walking along. We see Michael, and I think I can then truly say to David, she believes Michael Jordan is tall. I think I say something true if I say that. Well, what does that mean? That means that although I was in a high standards context when we were discussing that, our mutual knowledge that this conversation took place in a low standards context has the effect that when I attribute the belief to that little girl, she believes Michael Jordan is tall, the standard that my utterance expresses is the low standard. If you like, I shift to the low standard when I disquote her utterance. Okay? So that seems right to me. So I think that Ludlow is correct and Hawthorne is in fact wrong about what happens in the case where I know that the person I'm disquoting is in a different context from my own. But now, what happens if I don't know that the person I'm disquoting is in a different context from my own? I mean, this could happen in two ways. I might fail to see the clear light of contextualism and so not know that descriptions of knowledge are context sensitive. In fact, I think this is the condition of the typical competent speaker of English. Or I might know that ascriptions of knowledge are context sensitive and just mistakenly think that the standards of our context are the same. What happens in that case? Well, there it seems clear to me that if I say, Rich believes that he knows he has feet, I might say, suppose I'm in a skeptical context, and I think Rich is too, and Rich says, I know I have feet. I'll say, Rich believes he knows he has feet. And now I am attributing to him a belief he doesn't hold, because I mistakenly think he's in the same context of my own. And so this will entail a violation of the disquotation principle, okay, as Hawthorne says. So we do get the violation after all. So what do we say about that? Well, I think as a contextualist, I'm happy to say so much the worse for the disquotation principle. I mean, if knowledge is an indexical, you would expect disquotation to fail. I mean, disquotation principles won't hold for indexicals. If David says, I'm hot, quote, I'm hot, I can't say he believes I'm hot. It doesn't work. Of course, the way Hawthorne... Have you guys been drinking this morning too? Get your minds out of the gutter and let's go back to philosophy. Maybe he does. I don't know. But of course, the way Hawthorne's argument is supposed to work, and Stanley's and Wayne Davis, he's a terrific philosopher, Wayne Davis. I don't know if you know him, but if you don't, you should read his stuff. Anyway, it's supposed to work this way. You're supposed to look at the disquotation principle, think, boy, that looks true. That you can just quote knowledge utterances. You're supposed to think, that's got to be right. Then you say, contextualism violates the principle, and so contextualism must be false. That's the way the argument is supposed to go. So should we reject contextualism after all? Well, here's what the contextualist should say, I think. The reason we think the disquotation principle is true is because in most contexts, the disquotation principle will express a true proposition, if you like. The sentence will be true in most contexts, but in some funny kinds of, or I should say situations, in some funny kinds of situations where you have people talking, where you have a reporter reporting on a scriber's utterance across contexts, where the reporter is in a stricter context than the speaker, you're going to end up, there the disquotation principle is going to run into trouble. So what I think the contextualist should endorse is, I think this is on the handout, is something I call metalinguistic disquotation principle for knowledge, a schema for knowledge, and it goes like this. Number 5, a sentence of the form, quote, if an English speaker E sincerely utters a sentence S of the form, quote, I know that P, and the sentence in the that clause means that P, then E believes that he knows that P and expresses that belief by uttering S. The sentence of that form is true when uttered by A, just in case both A's utterance and E's utterance are governed by the same standard. Don't try that at home. Actually, I think what I should have said was, just in case A's utterance is not governed by a higher standard than E's utterance. They don't have to be the same. So now the issue I have to face is the truth of the metalinguistic disquotation principle sufficient to explain why competent speakers want to endorse the original DSK, and I think it is. Note that a disquotation principle, just as a disquotation principle for knowledge strikes competent speakers as plausible, so will an analogous object language disquotation principle for other indexicals like flat. So look at DSF. If an English speaker E sincerely utters a sentence S of the form X is flat, and E believes that X is flat and expresses that belief by uttering S, that seems to me just as plausible as DSK, but owing to the fact that I think flat is indexical as well, you'll get the same kinds of problems. So at most, we should endorse MD, what I call metalinguistic disquotation for flatness. I won't read it. It's the same thing. Do I have a few more minutes? 5 minutes. Okay. So the contextualist can hold, then, that since any disquotation principle for what you can think of as an impure indexical, as opposed to say I is a paradigm of the pure indexical, the impure indexicals have non-indexical and indexical elements. So the contextualist can hold that since any disquotation principle for an impure indexical, or at least some disquotation principles, object language disquotation principles, for impure indexicals require a metalinguistic formulation, it's no problem for the contextualist to hold that a metalinguistic principle for knowledge, a disquotation principle for knowledge requires a metalinguistic formulation. And note that the contextualist strategy for dealing with apparent violations of the closure principle is just the same. You can't just give an object language statement of the closure principle, because you'll get, as Gretzky pointed out, all these instances of the lottery paradox will appear to falsify it because there's a mid-sentence shift. So you have to talk about when sentences expressing the closure principle are true, and you say that those sentences are true at every context. So the closure principle is analytic in Kaplan's sense, that I am here now is analytic in the logic of indexicals, or necessary. It expresses a true proposition at every context. Okay, I was going to dazzle you with more examples of all this, but given the time, let me move on to a final point that's very crucial, the semantic blindness thesis. So the semantic blindness thesis says the following thing, that competent speakers of a language, there can be an indexical term in a language, context-sensitive term. Competent speakers of the language, since they're competent, their use of the term tracks changes in context. That happens. So they use it correctly, but they're unaware that this is what's going on. They don't know that the term is context-sensitive. Now, many people, most notably Stephen Schiffer, object to this. They say this is a, Schiffer in typical Schiffer fashion says this is a ludicrous thesis. How could, we don't get confused about I. I didn't think that David thought that I was hot. Again, I'm remaining officially neutral on that, but I didn't infer from the fact that he said, quote, I am hot. So it's ludicrous to think that this could happen in the case of no. Now, my response to this is there are other cases of impure indexicals where you have precisely this phenomenon of semantic blindness. A couple minutes. Consider Unger's case for flatness skepticism, if you like. It's very easy to get people in a frame of mind where they can think nothing is flat. So you think this table is flat. Here, look through this microscope. You'll see all kinds of peaks and valleys. You do this with any surface. You'll see that there's great variations. And if you raise these sorts of considerations, if you make deviations from geometric flatness salient, people will find it very compelling to say, nothing's flat. I thought things were flat, but in fact, they aren't. Physics has shown that nothing is flat. You do the same thing with solids, by the way. Now, when competent speakers say nothing is flat, they take what they're saying to contradict their previous ascriptions of flatness to surfaces in everyday context. They think, gee, when I said earlier this table was flat, I said something wrong. What should we say about this situation? Who's right? I mean, are we right? Nothing is flat, or are some things flat? Well, I think the only sensible thing to say about this, although this has been called into question recently by Kaplan and Lepore and others, but it's ludicrous. I think the only sensible thing to say is that ascriptions of flatness are context sensitive. Relative to ordinary standards, this table is flat, so we can truly say that. You start thinking about Unger-style considerations, the standards go up, you can truly say nothing is flat. But notice, competent speakers, when they first get into this paradox, think that when they say nothing is flat, that they're contradicting their previous flatness ascriptions. And if that's so, then I've got an existence proof of the possibility of semantic blindness. Because precisely what happened is they were competent speakers, so their flatness descriptions tracked the change in context. They went from saying the table was flat to the table was not flat, but they were unaware that this was going on. So, therefore, there's nothing wrong with saying the same thing happens in the case of knowledge description.